Hi Gators! I hope you guys are doing awesome. In our last lesson, we learned a ton of new vocabulary to start off our geometry chapter. I hope that you took the time to go ahead and put that into your vocabulary builder so you do have that to help you as we move forward in the chapter. Now, to rehash some of what we learned the terms line, we learned line segment, we learned about rays and points and endpoints, and we used all of this vocabulary to help us describe something called plane shapes. Now, plane shapes are just two-dimensional shapes. Two-dimensional means we measure them by their length and their width, and there's no kind of thickness to them, no depth. They're very flat. And when we talk about plane shapes, we mainly talk about two types. And these are the two types that you identified and worked with in our last lesson, which is open or closed. And they're just what they sound like. An open plane shape would be something like a squiggle, and a closed plane shape would be something like a circle or a square or a diamond. Those things that you think of when I ask you to pick a shape, right? And an open shape is called open because it looks like it's open, and a closed shape is called closed because it looks like it's closed. Today we're going to build on what we know about plane shapes by learning about something called angles. But what is an angle? So an angle is made when two rays or two line segments share an endpoint. So here I have two rays. You can tell that they're rays because they have an endpoint on one end and an arrow on the other, indicating that they start and go on from that point. And they meet at their endpoints. They connect here. This space inside of those two lines, that's what we call an angle. And we're used to talking about them a little bit more when we look at shape. So here's a plane shape. It is a quadrilateral. It has 4 line segments that make it up, and they meet at their endpoints. So how many angles do you think that this shape, this quadrilateral, has? It has 4, right? It has an angle in between these 2 line segments, or where this endpoint is. It has an angle in between these 2 line segments, or where that endpoint is. It has one here, and it has one here. So it has 4 angles. Now, are there different kinds of angles? That's the question we're going to focus on today. So we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of angles. The most important one that we're going to start with is called a right angle. And I'm going to show you my anchor chart, and then I'm going to do a little activity with you to help you remember these words. All right? So a right angle, this is my same shape from my first page, is an angle that forms a square corner. And you can see here that if we look at these 2 pieces of our shape, these 2 angles, they make what looks like an L. So if I wanted to, I could draw in the other half of a square. That's what they mean when they say it makes a square corner. It makes that nice L shape. So those are called right angles. Don't they look so right? They do, right? Now today they're only going to ask you to describe whether the angles you see are right, bigger than a right, or less than a right. But I want to tell you that there are names for those angles. So if we continue looking at this shape, there is an angle in this shape that is less than a right angle. So what that means is instead of being an L, it's closer together than that. That space in between those 2 line segments is smaller than a right angle. So that's called an acute angle. And an acute angle is just an angle that is less than that of a right angle. So if you think of a right angle as a nice L, acute angle is if you squished those 2 lines a little closer together. And one way to remember this is to think that because it's little, it's so cute. It's a cute angle. All right, and then the last kind is if it's greater than a right angle. So if it's greater than a right angle, that's like if we took our right angle and we put those lines farther apart so that they extended and we had a bigger space in between them. We call that an obtuse angle. And again, these are just words I'm introducing to you. You don't need to know them for the lesson today. The biggest thing is to know that a right angle makes that nice L shape, and that we can use that to describe whether something is greater or less than a right angle. All right, so this shape, if I were to describe it with angles, I could say it has 2 right angles, 1 acute angle, and one obtuse angle, or two right angles, one angle that is less than a right angle, and one angle that is greater than a right angle. All right, so now's a great time to pull out a piece of paper and a pencil and prepare to work through some problems with me. If you want to find your lesson in your Big Go Math book so that you can work through practice problems on your own, that's great too. Please feel free to pause this video at any time if you want to go at your own pace, or go back and rewatch what we've already said if anything sounded confusing and you don't feel ready. All right, so we're going to look at some problems that you're going to see today. Again, you're going to be using your vocabulary from today's lesson to describe some plane shapes. So here we have a triangle, and it says how many angles are inside of this triangle. So let's go ahead and take a moment and examine our line segments. So I have a line segment here would be 1, here would be 2, and here would be 3. And wherever I have one of those endpoints, I'm gonna find that those two line segments meet and we're left with an angle. So I have one angle here, I have what looks like a right angle there, so I'm gonna draw a square, and I have another angle there. So I can see I have 1, 2, 3 angles. One right angle, and these two, because they're small, are two acute angles, or two angles that are less than 90 degrees. And if you're ever not sure if an angle is less or more, you can go ahead and take your hands and kind of measure it with your fingers. Now, if your fingers are smaller than an L shape, then it means it's acute. If your finger wants to go bigger than an L shape, that means it is obtuse. All right, let's try some more problems. So label if the angles below are right angles, less than a right angle, or greater than a right angle. So I'm going to use the vocabulary I taught you. You're welcome to write less or greater if that works better for you. So here I see I'm looking at this angle in particular. And if I use my fingers and I kind of span them out along those lines, I can see that my hand is bigger than an L. An L would be straight. So because I'm extending that, it's going to be greater than a right angle, which is called an obtuse angle. And that just means greater than a right angle. Let's look at our next angle. Our next one, they want us to focus on these line segments and where they meet at their endpoint. So again, if I take my hand, I'm going to move to this side, and I kind of judge the measure. If I made an L, my hand would look like this, but I have to close those two lines closer together, which means it's going to be less than a 90 degree. So if it is less than a 90 degree angle, I do call that an acute angle because it's so cute. And last but not least, we have this angle here. Now, I'm going to teach you a little trick. Usually, if they show you this square, that's their way of already telling you what kind of angle it is. So, nevertheless, let's get our hands and look at our shape. So it is that nice, perfect L or square-shaped corner, which means that this angle is what's called a right angle. It is equal to a right angle. Perfect. So the problems you're going to see today aren't going to have so many words. They're usually going to provide you a shape, and they're going to ask you to describe how many of the angles inside of that shape are right, how many inside of the shape are less than right, and how many are greater than right. And as I said, today they're going to give you a little help by labeling those right angles with squares. So let's look at our first shape. Now is a great moment to pause the video and draw the 3 shapes we're going to practice with today. All right, so if I look, I can see that I already have my right angles labeled. I see 1, 2, 3 right angles, but they didn't measure this angle here, and they didn't measure this angle here. So if I look at those with my hands, I'm going to start here, and I'm going to see that my hand is a lot bigger than our L shape. So that means I have at least one angle that's greater than a right angle. Let's check the other one before I write my number down. So I'm going to go over here and the same thing. I'm just going to take my hand and kind of look. Again, it's bigger than that L shape. So I have 1, 2 angles in this shape that are greater than a right angle, and I have none that are less. So I'm going to write 0. So to describe the shape, I would say that this plane shape is made up of 3 right angles and 2 obtuse angles, or 2 angles that are greater than right angles. Next, we have this shape here. It's a quadrilateral, or it's made up of 4 line segments. And I'm going to go ahead and start looking at my angles. So if I look here, I can take my fingers and see that it is bigger than an L, because if I had an L, it'd go straight down like a square. So that means this is greater than a right angle. So I have at least one, and I could put a little tally if I want, that's greater than a right angle. If I go to my next little corner here, or my next angle, and I do the same thing, I'm going to see that again, it's greater than a right angle. It's not going straight down, which means I have at least 2 angles in my shape that are greater than right angles. Finally, let's look at our bottom angles. So I have an angle here, and if I use my fingers, I can see that it's a very tiny or acute angle. So that is an acute angle, or one that is less than a right angle. And I have my last one here, and I'll notice that it's the same thing. So as we saw no squares in this shape, and as we just verified using our fingers and judging these angles here, we can see that there are no right angles. We said that there were 2 angles that were less than right angles, and there were 2 angles that were greater than right angles. So to describe this plane shape, I would say there are 2 angles in this plane shape that are greater than right angles and 2 that are less than right angles, or there are 2 obtuse angles and 2 acute angles making up this shape. All right, last but not least, we have kind of an easier one here. Remember that these square corners tell us already that it is a right angle, but we can test it. We can look and see that these are very L-shaped corners, which means that those angles are right angles. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 right angles, no angles that are less than right, and no angles that are greater than right angles. All right, you're ready to go ahead and begin. If any of this video was confusing to you, please go ahead and go back and watch and work through the practice problems in your Go Math book. All right, Gators, good luck. Bye.